Hi everyone, and welcome to the video presentation for module number 7. This video is about how to harmonize a simple melody. So objectives for this video are to review the term harmonization, so kind of revisiting what we did last time, making sure that's solid, and then we'll apply the principles of counterpoint and chord progressions to harmonize a simple melody. So let's review what harmonization means one more time. Harmonization is the process of adding chords to a melody. And there are two things to think about when choosing a chord for a melody note. The first is that the melody note should be part of the chord that you pick. And then, this is what we talked about last time, the chord you pick should fit into the chord progression. And there are a couple ways to think about that. One was thinking about the chords as harmonic functions, right? Choosing a path from the one chord back to the one chord through harmonic function. You can think about the circle of fifths, right? Every chord is connected because it's a fifth away from the other one. And then you can also think about sequences. So those are three ways we talked about to organize your path from the one chord to the final one chord. So we won't go over that again. But the melody note being part of the chord you picked, just to kind of restate that, that means that each melody note will either be the root, the third, or the fifth of the chord that is possible. And we kind of went over that a little bit last time by listing all the chords that were possible for each melody. So this is going to be sort of the steps that you take in order to create a harmonization. And the examples that we'll be working on will kind of look like this. They'll be short four measure phrases with very simple rhythms. And then we'll give a chord to every single note that is in the melody. All right. So the first thing to do is simply list which chords could work with each melody note. So we'll go through this and we'll sort of use each note in the melody as either the root, the third, or the fifth of a triad. And remember, we're only using root position triads right now. So this will work pretty easily. So this is the key of F, right? Our first melody note is the note A. And if A were the root of a triad, then that triad would be the A minor chord, which would be the 3 chord in F, okay? So if A is the root, that's the chord that we would get. If A is the third of the chord, then the chord we would get would be an F major chord, which is the 1 chord. And then finally, if A was the fifth, then the chord we would get, the triad we'd have, would be the 6th chord, because that's a D minor chord. And a D minor chord has A, which is our melody note, as its fifth. So you can see that I've listed, the top one is always if that note were the root, the second one is always if that note were the third, and the last one is always if that note were the fifth. Okay? So let's do that for each of these. So this B flat, if that were the root, we'd have a 4 chord. If that B flat were the third, we'd have a 2 chord. And if that B flat were the fifth, we'd have a 7 diminished chord. This is the same chord as before, another A, so you can just kind of repeat ones you've already figured out because they won't change. If that G in that measure is the root, that chord will be a G minor chord, the 2 chord. If that G is the third, then the root of that chord, well, it'll be an E diminished chord, which means that it's a 7 diminished chord in the key of F. And if that note were the fifth of the chord, then this chord would be a C major chord, which is the 5 chord in the key of F. The next note is the F, and if F is the root, then we get an F major triad, which is the 1 chord. If that F is the third, we get a 6 chord, which is a D minor triad. And if that F were the fifth of the chord, we'd end up with a B flat major triad, which is the 4 chord. And going back to this chord with the E there, if E was the root, we'd end up with a 7 diminished triad. If that E were the third, we'd end up with a 5 chord, the C major chord again. And if that E were the fifth, we'd end up on our A minor chord, which is the 3 chord in F. And then we've already seen what F is, 1, 6, or 4. So that is quickly how you do this. And you'll get used to doing this quickly. You know, because in every key, it's simply a matter of sort of figuring out where that note is and then which 3 chords it can possibly be, right? So this is a good first step to kind of get used to it. Okay, so once you've done that, the next thing to do is eliminate any diminished triads from the list. So diminished triads are a little bit tricky because they only really work correctly when they are not in root position. And since we are only using root position chords, then we're just going to say, don't worry about diminished triads right now. So anything that is diminished, anything that has a little circle next to it, we're not going to use. We're not going to worry about. So in that for a second chord, we can really only use a 4 chord or a 2 chord, and we will not use that 7 diminished. For the second chord in the second measure, that can only now be a 2 or a 5. We won't use the 7 diminished. And there in the third measure, that 7 chord for that one is also not a possibility, only 5 or 3. Okay, so now we've kind of pared down our choices a little bit just by doing that. And then next, we'll choose the starting chord and the ending chords. And it won't always be the case, but for right now, what we're going to do is always start on the 1 chord. So our first chord there with that A, that can't be 3 and it can't be 6. We're only going to use 1 just because 1 is a good starting place for us right now. And then we're also always going to end on 1. So we're always going to be starting on 1 and then carving a path back to 1. Now that's not really how music always works, but it's going to work for our exercises right now. So our last chord will also be 1, okay? And then from there, you could probably use some of our knowledge about chord progressions and things like that, because there's only one of those chords left that's right before that 1 chord that can lead to that 1 chord, right? So the 3, if we're looking at the second to last chord to the last chord, that 3, right, it cannot lead to 1, right? That's not one of the things that 3 can do. The only chord that can lead to 1 is that 5. So that's the one that we have to use. So that also helps to make us make decisions here. So we can kind of pick the second to last chord as well. It has to be a 5 because that 3 cannot lead to 1. So there you go. Now you'll see that we had a bunch of choices before, and now we've eliminated some choices, and we only have a little bit left, right? So we're only really going to be picking chords for 1, 2, 3, 4 chords, okay? And within those, there are only 2 choices for some. All right, so the next step is to compose the bass part and make sure that it has good counterpoint and also follows a good chord progression, okay? So what do we mean by good counterpoint? Well, we mean the exact same thing as we did when we were writing our soprano line, right? So when we were writing our soprano line with our bass line already existing, we would have a lot of contrary motion. We would have mostly steps, which is not something we can do with our bass line. We would avoid especially parallel fifths and parallel unisons and things like that. So those are all the things that we want to do with our bass line. Now, like I said, the only thing that we really will not be able to do with just root position triads is have stepwise motion, because since all the roots are going to be pretty far from each other, we will not be able to move stepwise to all of our bass notes, okay? So what we'll mostly focus on is the contrary motion aspect and avoiding parallel fifths and things like that. So all of our bass notes will have the same rhythm as above, and I'm going to just start on the note F. So we're also picking bass notes that line up with these chords that we have as possibilities too, right? So if we start on the note F, that is the note that works with the 1 chord, that indicates a 1 chord in root position, okay? So our first bass note should be F, since that matches up with the 1 chord. All right, now I like to start at the beginning and then also skip ahead to the end too. So I see that there's only 2 possibilities here, right? Well, 1 possibility for each chord. Have to end on a 1 chord. So we could maybe use this F again, right? And then we want to have a 5 chord here. So the note that indicates a 5 chord, that's the root of the 5 chord, is the note C. So we could do this if we wanted to. But you can see that that's not ideal. So that has similar motion, right? So both voices move upwards. but we want to have good counterpoint. We want to have as much contrary motion as we can. So instead of using that high F, let's use the low F, because either F indicates or is the root of the 1 chord, right? It doesn't matter which F we use. So let's have our bass line leap down to that note F, and that way we get contrary motion with our soprano line. Okay, so those are the kinds of decisions we're going to make, choosing octaves sometimes too. Okay, all right, so now we only have 1, 2, 3, 4 bass notes to write. So now you kind of have to make some decisions and sort of, you know, deciding which bass notes will create the best kind of motion, and then also choosing which chords follow one of the chord progressions we talked about. So our soprano line goes up, and our two choices are either the 4 chord or the 2 chord. Well, the root of the 4 chord is going to be a B flat, and the root of a 2 chord is going to be the note G. All right, so we could pick the 2 chord, in which case we would move up to the note G, because you always want to move either by step or a leap of a 5th or a 3rd, right? And so that would work, but again, that creates similar motion between the two voices. So maybe that's not the best choice. If we wanted to stick with that 2 chord, maybe we could, instead of going up to the G by step, we could leap down by a 7th. Well, that is a pretty crazy interval, and again, we want to use good counterpoint, so we want to have singable leaps, and the leap of a 7th is not really an easy interval to sing. So we will not use that either. So that 2 chord's not really going to work for us. So let's not use it. Let's use the other possibility, which is the 4 chord. And again, the root of the 4 chord is B flat, so we could either leap up to it, right? But that creates similar motion in both voices, so we don't want to do that. We want to create contrary motion whenever we can. So we'll leap down by a 5th to the B flat. So that'll be our first choice. So we'll go with the 4 chord, and we'll get to that 4 chord by leaping down to the B flat. Okay. Now once you've picked a chord other than the 1, you have some rules to follow, because these chords can only really go to certain other chords. So a 4 chord cannot go to a 3 chord, and a 4 chord also cannot go to a 6 chord, right? Because the 4 either has to go to a 1, or it can go to a 5, or it can go to a 2. So it can't go to a 3, and it can't go to a 6. So the only possibility we're left with is the 1 chord. So we will write that in our bass line. So we want to create contrary motion. So we'll go back upwards to the F and end up on that F there. Okay, so far we have this bass line. Okay, sounds bassy. Now, in this next chord here, we can either choose the 2 chord or the 5 chord, right? And again, you can think about contrary motion. So what would create contrary motion? Well, going to the 5, right? We could go down to the 5 here if we wanted to. That would be similar motion, so that won't create contrary motion. But maybe we could go up to the note C if we wanted to. The problem with going to C is now we're left with not very much space between our bass and our soprano. So remember, we're going to try to fit in 2 other voices here. So this is a really tiny space, and if we kind of follow this to the conclusion, right, we may go back to the 1, but we could also go to the 6. So either of those isn't really a good choice for spacing this out. So I think going up to the C is not really a great idea either. So let's not do that. Instead, let's go to our 2 chord. So if we go to a 2, we'll have stepwise motion up to the G. And we will not use our 5 chord, we'll just use 2. Okay. And we have contrary motion by step. That's fine. All right, now we need to pick one of these chords that can go to a 5 chord. All right, well, maybe we can follow our 2 with our 6. Maybe that would work. So let's put the note D here. Okay. Well, that might work, but again, we don't have contrary motion, and 2 doesn't really lead to 6, so that won't really work. So let's not do that. What if we tried maybe a 4 chord? So we go down to our 4 instead. I think that might work. Okay, let's try that. Okay. Now, there's another possibility we could have used instead of going to that 5 chord, right? The 2 chord, sorry. We could have gone to maybe the note C for the 5 chord. But the problem that creates is parallel fifths between our bass voice and our soprano voice. So those are to be avoided even when you're writing bass lines and soprano lines, right? So that is not a good choice for this either. So that's another reason to use the 2 instead of the 5 chord. So let's write that in. Okay, let's go 2 to 4 to 5 and then to 1. Okay. So there's our chord progression, our bass line that will set up our chord progression. Okay. All right, so let's call that good. Now, the next thing to do is to add the tenor part and the alto part. All right, so a lot of times when you write these bass lines, you'll only be left with a couple possibilities of how to voice things. So that's what is happening here at the beginning. We have an F in the bass, we have an A in our soprano. So to finish out this chord, right, we'll always need to add a third, a fifth, and an octave above the bass note. Well, we already have our third in that soprano, so we don't need that. We need a fifth and we need an octave, ideally. So the fifth will be C and the octave will be F. And there's really only one way to do that here. So put the F there and put the C here. Okay. All right, so from there, we can just kind of do the same thing. In this chord, this is a B flat chord. So we need to have an octave, a third, and a fifth above B flat. So the fifth above B flat is the note F, and we want to always keep common tones if we can, so that F can stay in our alto. And then our tenor can move up to the note D to become our third. And there's our chord. All right, and then here we have the same arrangement as before. We have an F in the bass and an A in the soprano, and we want a 1 chord. So we can just kind of keep things the same, so that F can stay the same between the 2 chords, and our tenor can move down to become the note C. All right. See how there's like as little movement as possible between our voices. That's always a good thing. All right. Now we're ending up on a 2 chord, and so the 2 chord is a G minor chord. We already have an octave here. We need a third and we need a fifth. Okay. So the third of the chord and the fifth of the chord are both close to the tenor. Let's see what happens if we move our tenor up to the note D. Okay, so here we have a fifth between our tenor and our bass. And then when we move in the same direction to that to the D, we end up with parallel fifths, which is not a good thing. So that D is not a good choice. And this brings up the issue of it's always best to move in contrary motion to one of the voices. So that, usually the bass voice. So that bass is moving upwards, so we want to move everything else downward to avoid any parallelisms. So that C should instead move down to the B flat. Okay. And then our F can move to the note D to become the fifth of the chord. And there's our complete chord. Okay. Now, in this next chord, we have we're going to go for the 4 chord. So we want a B flat as the root. We got that. We want a fifth. We already have that in the soprano up there. We want a third of the chord. And we can get that from our alto. Okay. And then we're going to want to double our bass note, our root note. So that'll be the B flat. So there's a good way to get that. Okay, we have all the notes we need. And in this next one, we're going to need an octave, a fifth, and third, as always. We already have our third in the soprano. So we need a fifth, and we need an octave, hopefully. So we'll move our alto note maybe downwards to the C. Okay. And if we had done it the opposite way, if we had moved our tenor up to the C, again, we would end up with a problem because we'd have B flat to B flat in our bass and tenor, and C to C in our bass and tenor, which is parallel octaves. So that is not what we want. So instead, our tenor should move downwards to become the fifth of the chord, the G. And then from here, we'll have our tenor move up to become the third of our final chord, and the alto can stay the same on the note C. And there are our inner voices. Let's play this and see how we did. Okay, so we composed, well, we listed all the chords that are possible, right? We composed a bass line that had as much contrary motion, avoided parallel fifths, and also follow the roots of the chords that we wanted. And in that way, we picked a bass line that follows this chord progression that we wanted. And we picked those chords based on all the things we know about harmonic progression. And then after we did that, we composed our inner voices to fill out those chords. And then we finished with a pretty decent harmonization. Okay. Well, that's the basics. This is a shorter video, and we'll be doing much more of this in class. But thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, like I said, we'll be going over it live as well. So thanks so much, and hope you all have a great day.